We are now going to hear from Dr. Cheryl Anderson, who has heard from her before at a TRP conference. All right. This morning, she will be addressing a new topic from what she's talked about at past conferences about why the Me Too movement matters for LGBTQ inclusion in the church. And I just want to share a little bit with you about Dr. Anderson, if you don't know who she is. Dr. Anderson is professor of Old Testament at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. She is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, and she is the author of multiple books, including Ancient Laws and Contemporary Controversies, which I first read in 2016, and it kind of blew my mind. And what I really appreciated about it, and one thing that I really appreciate about Dr. Anderson's work, is how helpfully and effectively she elucidates a lot of the connection points between LGBTQ exclusion in the church and other forms of marginalization and exclusion in the church as well, on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, on the basis of class, on the basis of nationality and economic status. And that's something too that when we think, certainly at the Reformation Project, when we think about things that should and should not change, one of the things that we do hope will change in churches, that we want to see that we want churches to be moving toward changing, is to realize, as they're coming to grips with the topic of LGBTQ inclusion, realizing how much harm has been done to our community, also recognizing that there are a multiplicity of communities and experiences, often overlapping, where our theology and our standard culture and practices in our churches have been leaving people out and not fully honoring people as equal image bearers of God. And so that's something too that can be difficult and scary for churches to try to realize, there are multiple ways that we've been messing up here, but we want to help guide people. We want to help guide people to recognize that it is possible to not just fix this topic, but to have this experience then change us in our empathy, in our compassion, in our consciousness, and in our understanding for how the body of Christ is treating its most marginalized members across the board. Because the way that the church's witness has been harmed by its treatment of LGBTQ people, that is part and parcel of how the church is undermining its own witness when it comes to its treatment of people of color, when it comes to its historic and in far too many ways ongoing treatment of women and the place of women in the church, its treatment of people with disabilities. And so while certainly our core mission at the Reformation Project is around reforming church teaching on sexual orientation and gender identity, we know that there's a deep value here about honoring each person as an equal image bearer of God. And so we want churches to really start to be thinking critically about what does that mean, not just with this topic, but how does this topic help us to see other things as well, because so many of them are connected. So many people have multiple marginalized identities that shape their experience in church and their needs in terms of having the true support and nourishment of a church community. And that's something I think Dr. Anderson really elucidates very effectively and powerfully in her work, and something that I'm looking forward to hearing from her this morning. So, with that, please give it up for Dr. Cheryl Anderson.
Thank you so much. I wanted to start with this cover of Time magazine. It was 2017. It's hard to believe that before 2017, we really didn't know about the hashtag #MeToo movement. And this was unusual, this cover, because it was the Time magazine Person of the Year, but as you see, it's a group of women, and they're referred to as the silence breakers. So they are the ones who came forward to talk about sexual harassment and sexual abuse. And even though you will recognize Ashley Judd and Taylor Swift, it's not just the entertainment industry. The other women represent other walks of life as well. It's important to remember that the hashtag #MeToo actually had been developed about 15 years ago by this woman, Tarana Burke. And so she has been very pleased with the way the hashtag has been picked up and has brought to light this issue to a much, much broader population. I want to just say, I see that Kathy Baldock is here, and I have to mention that this is her topic that she gave me, and I can say now that I'm grateful that she gave me this topic. I have to admit, though, initially it was like, is she setting me up? This is really a hard topic. But I thought, I'm a scholar, I know how to do research, I can do this. So you're going to see what I came up with. Again, it's easy to think that, okay, it's not just the entertainment industry, but it's only the secular world, that the church doesn't have this problem. I'm glad you're laughing at that, yeah. This image here is an image that appeared on the first installment of a series of 6 articles on the hashtag Church2 movement, specifically with respect to the Southern Baptist Convention. And this image is an image of some of the more than 200 pastoral leaders in Southern Baptist churches who either have pleaded guilty or were convicted of sexual crimes while serving as Southern Baptist church leaders. It's important to acknowledge that the Southern Baptist Convention did not initiate this study. This study was initiated by 2 different newspapers in Texas, and they found that in the most recent 20-year period, there were over 400 pastors and pastoral leaders against whom there were credible allegations involving 700 victims. So this is not an isolated problem. It's also not a problem that's unique to the Southern Baptist Convention, but I want us to understand why there is probably a higher prevalence. So again, it's easy to think that this Me Too movement and Church2 movement don't come together, that one's secular, one's church. And this is Rachel Denhollander. And in her own experience, these 2 movements come together. She was a gymnast. She's now a lawyer, but she was a gymnast on the USA gymnast team. And she was the first gymnast to come forward and say that the doctor for the USA gymnastic team had committed sexual abuse against her. She was the first one. Since then, she's also acknowledged that she was sexually abused in her church at the age of 7. And she detailed a pattern where the person who commits it, even if they come forward, even if the person comes forward, the person will just be dismissed quietly. It won't be talked about. No one knows really what happened, and it's just shrouded in silence. And she's an advocate now that wants us to look at the institutional patterns that allow this to continue. And the silence, of course, is a large part of how this continues. So, to answer the question, why does the hashtag #MeToo or the hashtag Church2, well, how do these movements relate to LGBTQ plus inclusion? Let me just say right now, if I had to answer it in one word, that one word is gender. So that's the connection, and what I'm going to be talking about is what gender actually means. So, I'm going to show you an image, and it's an image of the ideal family. You will quickly see that it ain't my family of origin. So don't think I'm beholden to that image. In fact, I'm going to spend most of my time pulling apart that image. But at any rate, this is what we are told is the image of an ideal family. And this statement is from a very well-known feminist theologian, Rosemary Radford Ruether. And I had the honor of teaching with her because most of her career was spent at the institution where I now teach. And this statement summarizes a number of things about our idea of the ideal family. So I want to set gender within this larger framework. There is one superior race, white Western Europeans. There is one exclusively true religion, Christianity, and one right kind of Christian, a born-again evangelical Protestant. There is one right family model, a heterosexual, monogamous marriage with a male breadwinner and a female housewife. There is one right economic system, free market capitalism, and one chosen nation, the United States of America. So the key words for our discussion about gender are the heterosexual, monogamous marriage, and then the roles that are prescribed. The male breadwinner, he works outside the home. The female housewife, she works within the home. Now, immediately you can see that it doesn't apply to all families because you have to earn a lot of money to be able to let her be a stay-at-home mom. So if you're poor, both the husband and the wife are working minimum wage jobs. So just to be clear, there are many things that are also part of this idea of gender and the ideal family. So let's talk about gender complementarity, because that is, in fact, the kind of gender construct that I'm talking about. And people tend to think that it only means one thing, which would be opposite sex sexual attraction, but actually it means 4 things. And it's important to take each of them in turn. Also, a mistake is that we normally think it only pertains to heterosexual men and heterosexual women. So I'm going to go through this twice because it actually does 2 different things at the same time. It's really quite clever. So it's a gender binary, which means it's like an on or off switch. The light is either on or the light is off. It ain't a dimmer, okay? You can't dim the light. It's either on or it's off. You're either male or you're female, right? So, okay, it can apply to heterosexual women. It's heteronormative, which means opposite sex attracted. Oppositional, meaning that the qualities for a man are not the qualities for a woman. So, girls are emotional and cry. Boys don't cry. That's what the oppositional qualities mean. And it's hierarchical, but I think people misunderstand what hierarchical means because they think it sort of means that women have to walk 4 steps behind men, and that's not what it means. It means that they're privileges just by virtue of being a man. So think of unequal pay, where women do the same jobs as a man, but they don't get the same pay. That's what it means. They're privileges that just fall in your lap because you're a man. That's what the hierarchical notion means. So it's defining heterosexual men versus heterosexual women, but let's go through this again and think about how it impacts LGBTQ plus inclusion. It's a gender binary. You're either male or female. It totally eliminates the possibility of being trans or non-binary, just by that quality alone, just by definition. It's heteronormative, so it's going to eliminate the possibility of having same-sex attraction or no sexual attraction at all. These are by definition eliminated. Oppositional, it means that these qualities can't change across different gender identities or sexual orientations. And it means also that you don't then get to have any privileges of being either white or male, even if you're cisgender, if you are homosexual. So gender complementarity doesn't just apply to heterosexual identity, it also, by definition, excludes anything else that's different. So let's see how this works. And I have another image, and notice how these are nostalgic type images going back to the 1950s. And I think they serve a purpose, because I think nationally we have a kind of nostalgia for this kind of family. But I want you to think carefully about what it represents, because it's clearly the male breadwinner. He's got his suit and tie on, so he's working in the office. He comes home and his wife has been the homemaker and she's made a cake. I mean, it's just this idyllic kind of image. But I want to ask you, who's not in this image? Who's not there? And I can tell you right now, they do not have African American neighbors. Remember, there were laws that prevented that. Housing segregation. So this family is in an all-white neighborhood. So when I see a picture like that, where am I? Even though I am a cisgender, heterosexual woman, where am I in this picture? And I know where I am in this picture. I'm in the kitchen. And that says nothing against domestic workers, women. My foremothers on both sides of my family were domestic workers, but I just know I wouldn't have been good at it. I can't cook, you know? So I knew very early on that I did not fit the gender stereotype for an African American woman. I don't want to clean homes. I wouldn't be good at it. I'm ordained. I was a lawyer for 10 years before I went in to become a professor. I break that traditional mold. I've never been married, don't have children. I knew that my very existence was against traditional stereotypes for women, and particularly for a Black woman. So let me ask you a question then, in terms of how these kinds of gender constructs work. Where would the LGBTQ plus community be here? And for the sake of argument, let's sort of condense it down to where gay men would be. Where would gay men be? They're in the closet. Right? That's it. I'd be in the kitchen, they'd be in the closet. We are not in this picture. And I realized very, very early on that my ability to be outside of the kitchen was directly related to making sure that the LGBTQ plus community did not have to be in the closet. So in fact, another title from my talk could be why I, as a cisgender heterosexual woman, why I'm so committed to LGBTQ plus inclusion. And that image there sort of sums that up. So I'm a scholar, as I said, a seminary professor. I do research for a living. And I can't just tell you what my opinion is about things, although I think my opinions are really good. And I'm almost always right. But I had to find a scholar. You got to always connect what you're saying to a scholar. So I found a French social scientist whose name is Pierre Bourdieu, and he looks at power dynamics in society. For any of you who've done any graduate level work in the humanities, you've probably come across his work. He died about 20 years ago, but believe me, his name is still mentioned in so many dissertations and theses because he talks about power and how power works in societal systems. So he had been criticized during his career because he had talked about power dynamics, but he had never talked about gender. And so just before he died, and again, he died about 20 years ago, and about 20 years ago, this book appeared in English, Masculine Domination. So he then turned his attention to how these power dynamics work with respect to gender. So it was first published in France, and obviously in French in 1998, and then about 2001, that's this edition when it was published in English. So what did he say? Since he investigates power, how did he relate power to the issue of gender? And he redefines it in a way, he defines it in a way that I found very, very helpful. He said that gender is an exercise in power. That's basically what it is. It's a kind of power relationship. And so masculinity is defined as dominance, but that doesn't really tell us very much about how it operates. And so he actually says that it operates in a way where you need to look for certain qualities. And these qualities are virility, aggression, and competition. That's how masculinity gets defined. Femininity, then, you would normally think if masculinity is dominance, then femininity would be subordination. But that actually doesn't give you a sense of how these roles change in different times in different places. Erasure is a better term because it basically just means that women don't get to define what that role is, that it's imposed upon them, it's projected on them. And let me give you an example why subordination doesn't work. I lived, my PhD is from Vanderbilt, so I lived in Nashville for 7 years. And there was a case with one of the biggest Baptist churches in Nashville at the time, where a woman who, by Southern Baptist traditions, was able to preach and teach in Africa or Asia. She'd been very successful, but when she came back to Nashville, she wasn't allowed to speak from the pulpit because women can't be ordained. So if you just define femininity as subordination, it doesn't make sense because, I mean, she was out preaching the gospel in other parts of the world. Obviously, that's not subordination, but erasure meant that she could only serve that purpose. She could only have that particular ministry in certain settings, and it was not with respect to her own home congregation. So femininity is this kind of erasure, a lack of a voice, a lack of being able to define for yourself what your role is. Then what he says is male-to-male sexual relationships are constructed. Now remember, he's a sociologist, anthropologist, so he's thinking theoretically and in symbols. And so theoretically, male-to-male female relationships are feminized. And I think there's a mistake if you think that it means that there's a sense that gay men are effeminate. That's not what this means. What this means is if you take, I think it's easier to understand it if you think of the fact that a cisgender gay male makes a traditional notion of anyone who holds a gender complementarian notion tightly very nervous. It would make that person very nervous because they look like the Father in those images. They could pass for the Father in those images. And there are TV shows that are still on today where some of the fathers in those households were played by cisgender gay men. So that's the problem. It's like they look just like us, you know? You gotta find a way to erase them as well, to marginalize them. Remember, just by the definition of complementarity, you've already eliminated trans, non-binary, lesbian. You've eliminated all of them just by definition. But there's something about cisgender heterosexual men that is threatening. And so what you do with them is that you sort of, if you think of a privileged cisgender homosexual male, you sort of throw a blanket over him and say female. And once you do that, you can also eliminate them, but you have to work at it. It takes more work than just eliminating them by definition. So the basis for this is to understand that the exclusion of gay men in particular, for that group, it's done on the basis of devaluing women. Because the way you devalue the man, the cisgender man with same-sex attraction, is that you feminize him. And so the basis for that is that the devaluation of women in general is associated with the devaluation of homosexual men. So you can't pull those two concepts apart. They work together, they exist together, and they reinforce one another. So, with Bourdieu's definition of masculinity being related to virility, aggression, and competition, we shouldn't be surprised that we see high rates of gender-based violence, high rates of violence against women. And that's exactly what the hashtag #MeToo and hashtag #ChurchToo movements are trying to get at. I didn't want to bore you with a lot of statistics, but I did want to show you just the different names that we've had to come up with to describe what is overwhelmingly male violence against women. Sexual harassment and sexual assault, and of course that would include rape. And in my lifetime, we've had to invent a new term, date rape. Because before there was this notion, oh, if a woman is raped, it's by a stranger. No, it's someone she knows. That's what we now know statistically. Intimate partner violence. From again, just Google the statistics. I've been researching this because my doctoral dissertation was on violence against women and the construction of gender in biblical laws. And the statistics have gotten worse just in the 20, 30 years that I've been looking at this. So stalking, I mean, we now know that if a woman is being stalked, it's a step towards violence that escalates. It's an escalating step. We've had to come up with new names for the number of women who were killed by people who who tell them they love them. In the United States right now, 3 women are killed each day by a boyfriend or husband. And we don't even talk about it. That's the thing that surprises me. We are so immune to violence against women in this culture that we don't even talk about it. Why isn't this a political issue? I would love to ask a candidate, what are you going to do about the rampant and pervasive violence against women in our culture? Transgender women of color, you have a toxic mix where there's the issue of non-heteronormative sexual expression as well as non-binary gender identity, and a devaluation of people of color, and you have just this toxic mix that leads to these high rates of homicides concerning trans women of color. And then mass shooters. You know, we always go through this soul searching of what causes this and all that sort of thing. The one thing that has been most consistent in identifying mass shooters is that they have a history of violence against women. And so, again, we know that these things are happening. We have the statistics, and yet we can't come to grips with them, because to come to grips with them would mean that we would have to redefine masculinity. That's basically it. And yet, to address this issue, one of the things I've noticed in many circles, in fact, even in other countries, in conservative evangelical circles or just church circles generally, they don't want to address the issue of violence against women. They don't want to even begin to say, maybe we need to treat women better. And I realized that they see the same connection I see. That if I am treated better and I don't have to stay in the kitchen, it means that you've got to let the LGBTQ plus community out of the closet. So that, watch the language, you'll hear people say, but this is a slippery slope. If we ordain women, we'll soon have to, be inclusive on the issue of gender identity and sexual orientation. They will actually say that. I'm not making this up. It's just, I came across an example just in doing this research, and I thought, boy, they're making my talk for me, because they're that obvious. We don't want to treat women better because we know we have to treat the queer community better if we do that. So it always bothers me when I am ordained, but to me, my ordination means that I have to be committed to inclusion. I know that just as there are Bible verses that would say I can't be ordained, there are Bible verses that are misinterpreted about gender identity and sexual orientation. I think I would be a hypocrite if I tried to keep another group out but say, but you need to let me in. It just doesn't work. So I talked about the investigation of the Southern Baptist Convention that was done by 2 newspapers in Texas. And as a result of that, again, my talk was made so easy by just looking at stuff online. So the Southern Baptist Convention held the Caring Well Conference just last month to address this issue of sexual abuse. And according to the publicity, it was to make churches safe for survivors and safe from abuse. That was the idea. In fact, Laura Denhollander spoke at that conference. But I want to talk about 2 speakers in particular. And again, I'm not Southern Baptist, I'm United Methodist. But I found it interesting that what they said was considered controversial and what I thought they said was pretty tame. So these are the 2 people, Beth Moore and Boz Tchividjian, who happens to be Billy Graham's grandson, by the way. So the 2 of them spoke, and Beth Moore is sort of, I guess, thought of as a troublemaker, although she says that she's not trying to seek ordination for women. She's just trying to bring attention to this issue of sexual harassment and sexual abuse of women. And in fact, she was interviewed and she was asked if she thought that complementarian theology caused abuse. And she said, the answer is no. Sin and gross selfishness in the human heart cause abuse. Demonic influences cause abuse. However, as a culture prevalent in various circles of the SBC, has a culture prevalent in the SBC, formed and burgeoned out of it, contributed to it, and she said yes, absolutely and heavily. And she did go on to say that such theology has been elevated to such a core idea that it was elevated above the safety and well-being of many women. But again, I mean, this is pretty tame to me. She's just saying, I'm not asking you to change it. Just realize that we always have to be aware of the well-being of women. Now, I would say that as long as that complementarian theology is in place, treatment of women won't get any better, but that's my thing. So, what does he say? All right, he said, I mean, it was really interesting. He was far more forceful, and he said two things that just really impressed me. He said that the usual line that the Southern Baptist Convention will say is that our churches are independent. We have no authority over them. We can't be expected to control this. And he said, just let one of them ordain a woman or a gay male and see how quickly you do discipline them. So that authority can be used, they just don't use it to protect women, is basically what it is. And then he went on to say that you can't have a system that excludes women from leadership. Now, I don't know if he supports women's ordination or not, but he did say that, and I'll have to read you this quote because it's just so beautifully worded. He said, if more women were in leadership in those rooms and making decisions, we would have gotten rid of the whole issue. Trust me. But again, I think that we really need to go back and think about how gender, this complementarian theology works, and how until you also are inclusive of particularly the cisgender gay male, you've got to be able, you're not going to really improve the situation for women. So, in all fairness, there is a biblically based movement for women's ordination. And the group is called, this is just their website, the first image on their website, and it's Christians for Biblical Equality. Now, what they say sounds very good on the website, women and men leading together, serving as equals. And they say that they are working with church leaders to prevent abuse and create communities where men and women flourish as equals. So they support, as I understand it, women's ordination. But, as I also understand it, they started in opposition to LGBTQ plus inclusion. So they're trying to do that middle line where you ordain women, but you exclude LGBTQ plus persons. And again, as I hope I'm communicating, that doesn't work because the exclusion of that community is based on the devaluing of women. So if you think of, I think I want to go back to that image of the woman serving cake. To me, this kind of biblically based equality argument is sort of like saying, well, the woman in that image can serve cake and serve communion. You know, it's sort of like saying, but notice how the structure around it remains the same. You still have people who will remain in the closet with that. And I don't think that that is really a healthy model. So I hope I've connected the dots with violence against women and a kind of gender construct. But I don't know how persuasive that is in this society. Again, I think we're so immune to men being violent and women accepting that violence, that I actually think we've reached a point where that really isn't persuasive. So I thought, what could be? What could I find that might be persuasive? And so I was really excited when I saw this map. This map is primarily a map that shows you the mortality gap for middle-aged white people in the United States. And it's particularly men. Now, let me say, as I explain this, what they have done, it's really kind of interesting what social scientists can do. They can project what natural lifespan should be. And they've found that in certain areas, white men die earlier than they should. And so that map pinpoints where you see this prevalence. And I have to say that the premature death rates have always been higher for black men. So that's not news. The news is that it's increasing for white men. That's what the news is. And they still don't die at the rates that black men do. But what I want you to see here is this notion of what they call deaths of despair. If you Google that, you will actually find literature on deaths of despair. And think about what that image of the ideal family does in today's context. As I've said, already you can't live up to that if your wife has to work. Marriage rates are not what they once were, so that the average age when someone marries now is not right out of high school or in the early 20s, it's later. 40–50% of all babies in this country now are born to unwed mothers. We had a black man elected president. I mean, just think about all of the ways in which today's environment does not reflect that idyllic 1950s family, and it causes despair. And so when you look at those deaths of despair, it's really interesting. What they will say, and you're going to be surprised, and I want you to laugh when you see it printed, because this is exactly the way it's going to appear. They die by suicide, alcohol, or opioids, right? But aren't these all ways of killing yourself? What they really mean is men are killing themselves, and it's by guns, alcohol, or opioids. That's what they really mean, but they don't want to say guns, so they just say by suicide. So we've got to see that image of that ideal family, that notion of gender complementarity is hurting men. It's hurting the very men that were supposed to benefit from it, because the world is so different. And I'm hoping that maybe if people see that statistic, this kind of graphic, that they might begin to say, maybe we do need to move away from it. It's not really helping anybody. And notice where the rates are highest. They're highest in those deep red states, figuratively. It's where that notion is held most tightly. It's lethal. It's lethal to men. It's lethal to women. It's lethal to anybody who's really alive. And so we need to reconsider it. So if this ideal family and that notion and all that comes with it is so problematic, how did we get it? You know, like really, how did we get that notion of those images with the family and the 2.5 kids? In my work, I look at Audre Lorde's work here with the mythical norm, which is white, heterosexual, male, and affluent. And very often what we think of as the Christian perspective is really that. It's one particular sliver of humanity's tradition, interpretation, and so forth. I always am aware of the fact as a black woman that I wasn't there when some of these so-called Christian perspectives were developed. And so it means that every other group that is outside that gets considered as other. So racial ethnic groups, LGBTQ plus persons, women, and people who are poor. In any of those situations, that model of the ideal family does not work, and as I'm saying, in today's context, it doesn't even really work for heterosexual men. So, what am I gonna propose? Because I'm not gonna leave you with just these horrible statistics and just say, we gotta find some good news here. So, it's one thing is that you redefine power. Instead of masculinity as power over, you define it as power with. So we reclaim masculinity. I find it fascinating that people will allege that feminists, liberals, progressives want to eliminate gender differences. And if I didn't find it laughable, I think I could actually find a response to it. But and it's laughable because the very definition of heterosexual, and as I said, I'm a cisgender heterosexual woman, the very definition of heterosexual means that I am attracted to the opposite sex, right? So, sexually. So what? I don't want to get rid of that difference. So by definition, that's not what we want. What we want is to stop defining masculinity in ways that hurt us. So what am I proposing? And I thought I would do it with a little alliteration, and so it's communication, community, and creativity. So if I were given my druthers, what are the kinds of ways that I would think we could reclaim masculinity? And the first one is communication. And I couldn't help but think of being around toddlers before they can really speak, or actually infants, where they first understand how a conversation takes place, where you talk to them and you pause and then they babble back. I just think that's fascinating, but because they've gotten the hang of it. They can't talk, but they know that a conversation goes both ways. So they'll babble and then they'll stop. And then, so you can go on like that. So I think we need to go back to the basics, and communication is something that we need to revisit. And what I want just once in my lifetime is to hear someone who represents either personally that mythical norm or institutionally, systematically represents that mythical norm. Ask someone on the other side, someone considered other, what can I learn from you? Ask a black woman, what can I learn from you? Ask a trans woman, what can I learn from you? Ask a poor person, what can I learn from you? I have never heard a privileged white heterosexual male or institution ask that question, because that's the way erasure works. You all have nothing to tell me. You have nothing to teach me. And I think we've gotten to a point where we need to recognize that we can work together. We can actually make this environment better for all of us. So that idea of communication, and then men need to be able to discuss how they feel. Again, I mentioned that I did work on gender-based violence for my dissertation, and one of the things that happens with those oppositional qualities of women being emotional and crying and men not crying is that we cut men off from human emotion. And so part of being able to communicate is, one, asking a question and waiting for an answer, and then it's also that sort of mythical norm, the man who represents that or the institution that represents that, then being able to say, wow, this makes me feel angry. It makes me feel uncomfortable that I never knew that this system hurt you. They need to be able to express emotions, and that we need to give them the room to do that. So communication, two-way communication. The other one is community. We need to recreate community. We have, and for me, this is one of the biggest things that a reforming of the church can do, because we have become so individualized, so focused on ourselves, that we really have lost a sense of community. And for me, a sense of community is not having everybody in your community look just like you. A sense of community means that there are values, principles, things that will unite people who look different and who are different. And that's what community is about. And part of that also for me means reestablishing connections. Have you been following the rates of increased suicides in young people? And they think it's due to social media because they're doing this all the time. Have you seen people sitting at a table and they're all on their, they're not communicating, they're not connecting with each other. For any kind of drug abuse program, one of the important facets is to recreate human connection. And we're starved for that. So we need to recreate community, reestablish connections as human beings. And then the final one is creativity. I admire the traditional concept of masculinity as being courageous and being a risk taker. And so for me, why don't we see that as being able to be courageous and take a risk, be creative, and create a new vision for family, a new vision for how we come together as a society. I think that it is possible to do it, but we need to be able to just have the will to do it. And I hope that we've reached a moment where we are able to do that. So I want us to reclaim masculinity. And interestingly enough, I want us to reclaim the clobber passages. Because as you've heard already in the conference, they really don't mean what people say they mean. But that gives us an opportunity to actually have a biblically based argument for #MeToo, #Church2 activism. Because what did we hear? That these texts are talking about excessive lust. They're talking about exploitative sexual relationships, sexual abuse. May I name some names for you? Larry Nassar, Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein. These are all cases in our headlines about just that. And we're so busy using these texts against loving same-sex relationships that we miss this opportunity to really use them where they belong. And I need to mention Judges 19 specifically because, and the Leviticus passages, because they have to do with a devaluing of women. It bothers me tremendously, whether you're progressive or liberal, and you read Judges 19 and you don't notice that the woman is thrown out to be gang raped. So that you're saying, oh, the only problem with that story is that it would have been a same-sex sexual encounter? Is that really the only problem with that text? The problem is that that woman is gang raped all night and left at the threshold of the door of the house. So we need to see that it's that devaluation of women that connects with all of the violence we're seeing in our society. Every time you use that passage and say that it only has to do with same-sex relationships, you're giving permission for that kind of treatment to happen to women. In fact, Virgil actually mentions gang rape as the quintessential heterosexual male act because, think of it, it shows virility, it shows aggression, it shows among your male boys competition, how cool you are. Gang rape is specifically mentioned. We need to use those texts to say this is how we should not be. This is how we should not treat women in the society. We shouldn't treat anyone in the society that way. And stop using them selectively to prove points that the texts weren't really meant to prove anyway. So reclaim masculinity, reclaim the clobber passages, and then this last one is reform. And I deliberately use this image, the creation image, because it reminds me of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3. Remember, I'm a professor of the Old Testament, and I have been teaching for 20 years, proud to say. And it's a United Methodist Seminary. Most of our students, although we have a great variety, most of our students come from United Methodist backgrounds. And it really distresses me how few students know that there are two creation stories in the beginning of Genesis. Genesis 1 is different from Genesis 2 and 3. And I know that's not what you hear in your churches. I know that. I've actually done Bible studies in churches, and I've had people look me in my face and say one is long and one is short, and that's the only difference. No, they were written at different times and by different communities for different purposes. And for me, what all of this means is that we need to reform how we read the Bible. We need to bring together academic information with the life of the church. And it's only because those two have been separated, I think, that we've gotten a lot of, there's been this prevalence of interpretations that really are harmful and don't have to be. These interpretations, I mean, I tell my students, the Bible doesn't have to hurt. And it's because we haven't put these pieces back together again. So if you know that there are two creation myths, it gives you a different sense of how the Bible was written. You get a different sense of what makes it a living word. It's not a living word because you take it from there and that time and that place and apply it now. It's a living word because the same Holy Spirit that inspired the writing of these texts can inspire us to rethink them and reinterpret them in our own time and place. The Bible isn't a set rule book. It really is going against the nature of the Bible to just take a verse out and say that's the whole sum of the story. As I mentioned, I was a lawyer. My dissertation looked at biblical laws, and the laws in Exodus are reworked in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy literally means the second set of laws, and those second set of laws are a reworking of what came before. The traditions kept reworking themselves over time. They saw it as a dynamic contextual process, and we should too. We need to be able to move towards fuller inclusion for a church that in fact emphasizes community and connection and creativity, and by all means that exhibits the love of God. Thank you.